The offer of marriage was not a proposal. It was a diagnosis. It was delivered in a room so cold that Sylvia Bellamy could see her breath, a faint plume of white against the drab grey of her aunt's lesser parlour. The man who delivered it, Gideon Seven, the 6th Duke of Kestrel Chase, stood by the window, his form a severe silhouette against the weak afternoon light. He was a man made of winter, all sharp angles and frozen stillness. He had been widowed for 3 years, and rumour held that his heart had been buried with his late wife. Looking at him, Sylvia believed it. The arrangement would be one of mutual convenience, he stated, his voice devoid of any warmth, a flat, toneless instrument of fact. You require an escape from your present circumstances. I require a duchess to manage a household I have no desire to inhabit. Sylvia's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She did not look at him. She looked at a small, frayed patch on the threadbare rug. Escape. The word was a key turning in a lock she hadn't even realized was rusted shut. For 5 years, since her parents' death had left her a ward of her Aunt Honora Crane, she had been a ghost in this house, an unpaid clerk and manager, her existence measured in balanced ledgers and averted gazes. You would be installed at Withycombe, the Duke continued, his words falling like chips of ice. It is neglected. The staff is minimal, the accounts in disarray. You would have a substantial and unrestricted budget to restore it. Your duties would be to make the house run. Nothing more. Nothing more. He meant no husbandly duties, no pretense of affection, no shared life. He was offering her a gilded cage, but one with warmth, food, and, most intoxicating of all, autonomy. It was more than she had. Here, in her aunt's house, she was a resource to be exploited. Her small inheritance had been absorbed into the household morass, her days spent meticulously documenting the very debts that her cousin Felicity's extravagances incurred. In return for these services, he said, finally turning from the window to fix her with his gaze, I will settle your aunt's outstanding debts in their entirety. You will be free of her. You will have your own allowance, paid quarterly for your personal use. His eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, held no pity. They held something far more unsettling. Appraisal. He was assessing an asset. She thought of the previous week, the day he had first appeared at this very house. He was a trustee of the Penrose estate, a creditor Mrs. Crane had been dodging for months. Aunt Honora, all fluttering hands and panicked smiles, had tried to placate him with weak tea and weaker excuses. Her cousin, Felicity, had preened and posed, imagining a ducal conquest. Gideon Seven had ignored them both. He had demanded the account books. Honora had produced the set she kept for show, the pages full of optimistic forgeries. The Duke had scanned them for less than a minute, his lip curling in faint, dismissive contempt. These are a fiction, he had stated. Show me the real accounts. Aunt Honora's face had paled. She had turned on Sylvia, her eyes glittering with malice. Sylvia, fetch the household ledgers for his grace. The command was a threat. Sylvia had retrieved the books she was ordered to retrieve, but she had also brought another, smaller volume, bound in simple brown leather. Her own private record, kept for her own sanity, where every penny was tracked with obsessive, painful accuracy. She had placed both on the table before the Duke. These are the ledgers my aunt requested, Your Grace, she had said, her voice quiet but steady. She had then pushed the smaller book forward. And these are the household accounts, the true ones. It was the most defiant act of her life. Honora had gasped, a choked, furious sound. The Duke had simply raised an eyebrow. He opened the small brown book. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustle of turning pages. He saw it all. The dressmaker's bills for Felicity, the gambling debts of Honora's late husband still being paid off, the way Sylvia's own small annuity was swallowed whole each year. He saw the systematic draining of a once respectable family's finances. He saw 5 years of Sylvia's invisible, uncompensated labor, recorded in her precise, elegant script. When he finally looked up, he had not looked at Honora or Felicity. He had looked at Sylvia. It was a look of stark, unadorned recognition. He saw not a poor relation, but a master craftsman. He had closed the book, stood, and left without another word. Until today. Now, in the cold parlor, the reason for his return was clear. He was not interested in a wife. He was hiring a steward. A very, very competent one. "Why me?" Sylvia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you value truth," he answered, without hesitation. "And because you are capable of creating order from chaos. I have seen the evidence." He gestured vaguely at the house around them. "This is chaos. Withercombe is chaos. I am offering you the tools to impose order. It is a skill you possess. I am prepared to pay for it." She thought of the cold that seeped into her bones each night in her small attic room. She thought of the condescending pity in her cousin's eyes, the sharp, calculating cruelty in her aunt's. She thought of the endless columns of numbers that represented a life being spent in service to people who did not value her. He was right. It was an escape. "I have one condition," she said, finding a sliver of strength. The Duke's expression did not change, but a flicker of interest appeared in his eyes. "State it." "My mother left me a small annuity, £500 a year. My aunt is the trustee. Before any marriage contract is signed, the trust must be legally transferred to my name, under my sole control." It was not just about the money. It was about reclaiming the last piece of her past, the last link to a life before this one. For the first time, a shadow of something other than cold calculation crossed his face. It was not warmth, but a kind of grudging respect. "That is a reasonable and prudent request. It will be done." He paused. "I am asking. Answer plainly. Do you accept my terms?" Sylvia looked past him, out the grimy window to the bleak London street. She could stay here and slowly fade into nothing, a footnote in a failing family's ledger. Or she could go with this cold, strange man to a neglected house and be something else. She did not know what, but it would be hers. The choice was hers. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "Plainly, Your Grace, I accept." And so, Sylvia Bellamy, a woman who owned little more than 3 worn dresses and a small, hidden silver locket, was betrothed to the Duke of Kestrel Chase. The contract was drawn up by his solicitors the next day. It was a document of brutal honesty, stipulating finances, duties, and residencies. It was a business merger. Aunt Honora, faced with the settlement of her ruinous debts, signed the transfer of the annuity with a hand that trembled with fury. Felicity wept with jealousy. Sylvia felt nothing but a quiet, unnerving calm. 2 days later, she was in the Duke's carriage, rolling north out of London towards the distant county of Marley. He sat opposite her, silent, a book open but unread on his lap. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since she had accepted his offer. As the city fell away, replaced by green fields and rolling hills, a sense of unreality began to set in. She was leaving the only world she knew for one she could not imagine. The journey took 2 days. They stopped at an inn overnight, where they were given separate, adjoining suites. He treated her with a distant, formal courtesy that was more isolating than outright cruelty. She was not his wife. She was his new, highly paid employee. Late on the second day, the carriage turned off the main road, passing through a set of imposing stone gates. A long, winding drive took them through a park of ancient, untended oaks. And then she saw it. Withycombe. It was not a house. It was a monument to sorrow. A vast Elizabethan structure of grey stone. Its many mullioned windows were like vacant eyes, staring out over a landscape of overgrown lawns and skeletal, leafless gardens. One wing appeared to be partially in ruin, its roof sagging. A cold mist clung to the ground, muffling the sound of the carriage wheels on the gravel. The place felt as if it were holding its breath. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. The Duke stepped out, then turned and offered Sylvia his hand. His touch was cold, brief, and impersonal. She stepped onto the gravel, her thin cloak providing little protection against the damp chill that radiated from the stone walls. An elderly butler, his livery faded, had opened the great oak doors. Behind him stood a handful of servants, looking nervous and weary. The Duke did not introduce her. He simply turned to Sylvia, his gaze sweeping over the cold, silent facade of the house. "The house is yours to manage," he said, his voice as bleak as the scene before them. "Do not fail." Then, without another word, he turned, climbed back into the carriage, and was gone, leaving her alone on the steps of her new home, her new life, her new prison. Sylvia watched the carriage disappear down the drive until it was just a speck in the twilight. She was the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, and she had never felt more utterly, terrifyingly, alone. She pulled her cloak tighter, took a deep breath that smelled of damp stone and decay, and walked into the house that was now her responsibility. The great doors closed behind her, with the hollow, echoing sound of a tomb being sealed. The silence inside Withycombe was a physical presence. It was heavier and deeper than the quiet of her aunt's house. That had been a silence of tension and resentment. This was a silence of abandonment and grief. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light slanting from the high windows of the great hall, illuminating shrouded furniture that stood like pale ghosts in the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, damp wool, and something else, something acrid and cold. The smell of a house without fires. The butler, whose name she learned was Hob, led her through the echoing corridors. He was a man well past his prime, his shoulders stooped, as if by the weight of the house's sorrow. "His Grace commanded a suite be prepared for you in the East Wing, Your Grace," he murmured, his voice raspy with disuse. The suite was vast, comprising a sitting room, a bedroom, and a dressing room. The furniture was magnificent, all dark carved wood and faded velvets, but everything was cold to the touch. A single meagre fire sputtered in the grate, a pathetic gesture against the cavernous chill of the room. Sylvia walked to the window and looked out. Below, a formal garden lay in ruins, its box hedges ragged and overgrown, its stone urns toppled and green with moss. This, she thought, was a perfect reflection of its master. A place of former grandeur, now frozen and neglected. Her trunk, containing her few possessions, had been brought up. She opened it and took out the small brown ledger she had shown the Duke. It was her only real weapon, her only true tool. She set it on the ornate writing desk. Then she rang the bell for the housekeeper. The woman who appeared was stout, grey-haired, and had a face set in lines of permanent disapproval. "You rang, Your Grace?" she asked, her tone making it clear she thought Sylvia had no right to the title. "Yes. You are the housekeeper?" "I am, Your Grace. Mrs. Perkin. For 30 years. The unspoken addendum was clear. "I was here long before you, and I will be here long after you're gone." Sylvia met her gaze steadily. She would not be intimidated. "Mrs. Perkin, I require a full accounting of the household, staff rolls, all supplier ledgers, inventories of the larders, the wine cellar, the linen closets, everything. I also require the estate accounts for the past 5 years. Please have them brought to my study tomorrow morning at 9. Mrs. Perkin's eyes widened slightly in surprise. She had likely expected demands for dressmakers or French maids, not ledgers. "The estate accounts are with Mr. Fletcher, His Grace's man of business in Marley." "Then send a runner to Mr. Fletcher. I expect him on my desk by noon," Sylvia said, her voice quiet but firm. "And Mrs. Perkin, see to it that every fireplace in the rooms currently in use is lit and kept burning. And I mean a proper fire, not a handful of twigs. There is to be no more cold in this house." A flicker of something, was it respect or just shock, crossed the housekeeper's face. "The coal allowance is restricted, Your Grace." "Then the restriction is lifted. See to it," Sylvia said, turning back to the desk as a clear dismissal. She spent that first evening not unpacking her clothes, but unpacking the house's decay. She ate a solitary, dismal meal of cold meat and stale bread in her sitting room, the fire behind her now roaring defiantly. After, she explored. Armed with a single candelabra, she walked the halls of Withercombe. She found the library, a magnificent 2-storied room where every book was coated in a fine layer of dust. The ballroom, its chandeliers shrouded in canvas, its parquet floor dull and lifeless. The picture gallery, where the portraits of generations of Sevens stared down at her with accusing eyes. She found Gideon's late wife, a beautiful, smiling woman with golden hair, her portrait draped in black crepe. Sylvia paused before it, a strange pang of sympathy for the cold man who had married her. This was the source of the silence, the heart of the frost. The next morning, at 9 o'clock precisely, Mrs. Perkin arrived with a stack of dusty, leather-bound books. She placed them on the desk without a word. At 11:30, a young clerk arrived from Marley, breathless, with a larger, heavier set of ledgers from Mr. Fletcher. Sylvia thanked him and closed the door. And then she began to work. For the first 2 weeks, Sylvia barely left her suite. She lived in a world of numbers, of columns and receipts. She did not see it as drudgery. She saw it as excavation. She was digging through the layers of neglect to find the foundations of the house. The estate, she quickly discovered, was immensely profitable. It had farms, quarries, and forests, all generating significant income. But the money vanished into a black hole of mismanagement. Bills were paid late, incurring penalties. Supplies were bought from overpriced merchants in London instead of local tradesmen in Marley. Wages were in arrears. The Duke, lost in his grief, had simply signed whatever his man of business put before him, and Mr. Fletcher, she suspected, was either incompetent or lining his own pockets. Her first act was to write a letter to Mr. Fletcher, her script clear and authoritative. It was a list of directives. All supplier contracts were to be reviewed. Tenders were to be sought from local businesses in Mali. A full audit of the past 2 years' expenditures was to be initiated immediately. She signed it not Sylvia, but S. Kestrel, a formal, unassailable declaration of her new role. Her second act was to address the staff. She gathered the small, demoralized group in the great hall. There were only a dozen of them in a house built for 100. "My name is Sylvia," she began, dispensing with the title. "The Duke has given me the responsibility of managing Withycombe. I know things have been difficult. That is going to change." She didn't make grand promises. She made specific ones. "Your wages will be paid in full and on time, starting this Friday. The kitchens will be properly provisioned. The house will be made warm. In return, I expect you to do your work to the best of your ability. Withycombe has been sleeping. It is time for it to wake up." The effect was not immediate, but it was palpable. A spark of hope had been lit in the suffocating gloom. The change began in small ways. The scent of baking bread began to drift from the kitchens for the first time in years. The sound of beeswax and lemon polish being applied to long-neglected wood could be heard in the corridors. And everywhere there was the crackle and roar of fires, pushing back the persistent, bone-deep chill. Mrs. Perkin watched it all with her stern, unreadable expression. She observed Sylvia's frugal but nourishing menus, her insistence on mending linens rather than discarding them, her long hours spent hunched over the account books. One evening, Sylvia was working late in her study, her eyes aching from the candlelight, when the door opened silently. Mrs. Perkin entered, carrying a small tray. On it was a cup of steaming chamomile tea and a single biscuit. She set it down on the desk beside the ledgers. "You'll work yourself into a fever, Your Grace," she said, her voice gruff, but without its former edge of hostility. Sylvia looked up, surprised. "Thank you, Mrs. Perkin." The housekeeper simply nodded and left. But the gesture was as loud as a declaration. It was the first domino. Loyalty was not a thing to be commanded. It was a thing to be earned. And Sylvia was earning it, one balanced account and one warm fireplace at a time. Her most significant discovery, however, was not in a ledger. One afternoon, seeking a respite from the endless columns of figures, she ventured out into the ruined gardens. She followed a crumbling stone wall until she found a heavy, iron-studded wooden door, half hidden behind a curtain of ivy. It was locked. But the wood around the lock was rotten. With a bit of pressure from a stone, the lock gave way. She stepped through into a walled garden. It was a secret, enclosed space, perhaps an acre in size, that had once been a paradise. Now it was a wilderness. Roses grew in tangled, thorny thickets. Weeds choked the gravel paths. A sundial in the center was obscured by ivy, and a stone bench had collapsed. But in the chaos, there was a strange, heartbreaking beauty and potential. Sylvia had grown up with a small garden. It was the one thing her mother had taught her, the one place she had found peace as a child. Standing in the heart of this wild, neglected place, she felt a sense of kinship. It was like her. It was like the Duke. It was a place of hidden life, waiting to be rediscovered. She went back to the house and found an old pair of gardening gloves and some rusty shears in a potting shed. And the next day, and the day after that, she began another kind of work. She started in one corner, methodically clearing the weeds, untangling the roses, pruning the dead wood. It was hard, physical labor. Her hands became calloused, her back ached. But as she worked, clearing away the decay, she felt as if she were also clearing something inside herself. She was not just restoring a garden. She was planting roots in the first place she had ever been allowed to call her own. One late afternoon, as the sun was setting, she was kneeling in the dirt, carefully tying a rambling rose back to the crumbling brick wall, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled. It was the Duke. He had arrived without announcement and was standing at the entrance to the walled garden, watching her. His face was, as always, an unreadable mask, but his eyes were fixed on her dirt-smudged cheek and her gloved hands. He had been gone for a month. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low. "It is your walled garden, Your Grace," she replied, slowly getting to her feet and brushing the soil from her knees. He walked slowly into the garden, his gaze sweeping over the small section she had cleared, the neat piles of weeds, the carefully pruned rose bushes. He stopped by the sundial, tracing a finger over the carved stone motto, now visible beneath the ivy. "Horas non numero nisi serenas." I count only the sunny hours. He looked around the wild, overgrown space, and then back at the small corner of order she had created. He seemed to see, in that one small patch, everything she had been doing inside the house as well. The warmth, the order, the slow, patient fight against neglect. He looked at her, his eyes moving from her worn gloves to her steady gaze. He did not smile. He did not offer praise. But he said two words that struck her with more force than any compliment. "It is improved." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the fading light. But Sylvia knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that something had shifted. The Master of Withycombe had come home, not just to the house, but to a part of himself he had long since abandoned. And he had found her there, quietly tending its ruins. Gideon Severn's visits to Withycombe became more frequent after that day in the walled garden. They were never announced. He would simply appear, a silent, brooding presence in the house that was slowly coming back to life under Sylvia's quiet command. He would walk the corridors, now warm and smelling of beeswax. He would stand in the library, where the books were now dusted and arranged, a fire crackling in the hearth. He never commented on the changes directly, but Sylvia saw him notice them. She saw the way his hand would trail along a polished banister, or the way his gaze would linger on the vases of winter foliage she had placed in the great hall. He took his meals alone in his study, as stipulated in their cold, precise contract. But one evening, Mrs. Perkin informed Sylvia, with a hint of nervousness, that His Grace requested her presence after dinner. She found him in the library, a decanter of brandy on the table beside him, a single glass poured but untouched. The estate ledgers, the new, clean ones she had created, were open on his desk. "Mr. Fletcher has resigned," he said, without preamble. Sylvia was not surprised. Her letters to the man of business had become increasingly pointed, her discovery of his accounting errors more difficult for him to explain. "I see," she said simply. "He cited an unwillingness to work under the supervision of a woman," Gideon continued, a faint, dry irony in his tone. "He was, of course, lying. He was stealing. You found it." It was not a question. "There were discrepancies," she confirmed. "Significant ones." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and penetrating. It was the same look of appraisal he had given her in her aunt's parlour, but it was different now. The calculation was mingled with something else, a grudging, growing respect. "I have appointed a new man of business from London. He will answer to you. The entire ducal enterprise, The quarries, the shipping interests, Kestrel Chase itself, the accounts, will all be routed through Withercombe. Through you. Sylvia felt a jolt, a mixture of shock and a strange, fierce pride. He was not just giving her a house to run. He was handing her the keys to his entire financial empire. He was placing a trust in her that was absolute and, in its own way, terrifying. "That is a great responsibility, Your Grace." "You have proven capable of it," he replied, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. He paused, his fingers drumming a soft, restless rhythm on the polished wood of the desk. "The county is beginning to talk." Sylvia's heart sank a little. She had lived in a quiet cocoon at Withercombe, insulated from the outside world. "About what?" "About us. About the mad, grieving duke who married a penniless nobody and locked her away in his derelict estate. They are curious. There is to be an assembly in Marley next week. We will attend." The thought sent a wave of anxiety through her. She had no desire to face the prying eyes and whispered gossip of county society. She had no ball gown, no jewels, no taste for the social maneuvering she had watched her aunt and cousin perform with such desperate energy. "Is that necessary?" "It is," he said, his tone final. "They need to see you. They need to understand that you are the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. It is better to face them now, together." Together. He had said the word at their first meeting, and again in the garden. Each time it landed with a quiet resonance, a small stone dropped into the silent pool of their arrangement. The night of the assembly arrived all too quickly. Sylvia dressed in the best of her old gowns, a simple dark blue silk she had refashioned herself. She wore no jewelry, save for the small, worn silver locket from her mother, tucked securely beneath her collar. When she descended the main staircase, Gideon was waiting at the bottom. He was dressed in severe black evening clothes, a stark and commanding figure. His eyes swept over her, and for a moment she braced herself for a dismissive comment about her plain attire. Instead, he simply said, "You are ready." He offered her his arm. His touch, as always, was formal, but as she placed her hand on his sleeve, she felt the warmth of his body through the fine wool. It was a small, startling intimacy. The assembly rooms in Marley were a riot of light, sound, and colour. As they entered, a hush fell, followed by a wave of excited whispers. Every eye was on them, on the formidable, reclusive Duke and his mysterious, plain-faced Duchess. Sylvia felt 100 pairs of eyes dissecting her, judging her dress, her posture, her very existence. She kept her head high, her expression calm, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm. They were immediately approached by a man whose polished charm was as bright and hard as a varnish. He was handsome, with a ready smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low to Gideon, though his gaze slid sideways to linger on Sylvia. "A pleasure to see you returned to society. And this must be your lovely Duchess." "Devereux," Gideon said, his voice clipped and cold. He did not return the smile. "My wife, the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, Mr. Piers Devereux." Sylvia inclined her head, murmuring a polite greeting. She recognized the name. Piers Devereux had been a frequent visitor to her aunt's house, a man Honora had courted relentlessly as a potential match for Felicity. He was known to have powerful connections and a dangerous wit. "Your Grace," Devereux said, his smile widening as he addressed Sylvia directly. "The whole county has been buzzing with the news. We hear you have a remarkable talent for household management. A veritable genius with an account book, they say." The words were couched as a compliment, but the condescending curl of his lip made the insult plain. He was reducing her to a glorified housekeeper, reminding everyone of her humble origins. The crowd around them tittered. Sylvia felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation, but she kept her face a placid mask. Before she could form a reply, Gideon stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and Devereux. His presence was so immense, so chillingly authoritative, that Devereux's smile faltered. "My wife's talents are indeed remarkable, Devereux," the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She has a particular gift for identifying fraud. You would do well to remember that." The silence that followed was absolute. The statement was a blade, slid cleanly between Devereux's ribs. It was a public warning, a display of ownership and protection that stunned the onlookers. Piers Devereux's face paled, his polished veneer cracking for just a moment. He stammered an excuse and melted back into the crowd. Gideon turned to Sylvia. "Would you care for a glass of punch?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. She could only nod, her throat tight. He had defended her. Not with passion, but with a cold, precise lethality that was far more effective. He had drawn a line in the sand, and the entire county had seen it. Their evening continued. They were approached by others, but the tone had shifted. The curiosity was now tempered with a new respect, or perhaps fear. The most formidable of these encounters was with a sharp-eyed dowager in a turban of purple silk, who cornered them by the refreshment table. "Kestrel!" she barked, rapping her fan on his arm. "So you finally crawl out of your cave? And you've brought this one with you?" Her gaze, as sharp as a hawk's, fixed on Sylvia. "I am Lady Maud Carmichael. I knew your mother. She had spirit. Do you?" Sylvia, startled by the directness, found her voice. "I endeavour to, my lady." Good answer. Not simpering," the old woman grunted. She looked from Sylvia to Gideon and back again. "Heard you're turning that ruin of his into a proper house." "Good. The man's been living in a mausoleum for too long." She gave Gideon a pointed look. "And I heard what you said to that popinjay Devereux. Very good. Man's a snake, always has been." She turned back to Sylvia. "You have an enemy there, and in your own family, from what I hear. That aunt of yours has a tongue like an adder. Watch your back, girl." With that, she nodded curtly and moved on, leaving Sylvia feeling as though she had just been inspected, weighed, and unexpectedly approved. Later, in the carriage on the way back to Withycombe, the silence between them was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken events of the evening. "Thank you," Sylvia said quietly into the darkness. "He insulted you," Gideon replied, his voice a low rumble. "He insulted my wife. It was a matter of fact, not a matter for thanks." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. It was the first time he had publicly claimed her as his, not just as a part of their contract, but as a person worthy of his defense. When they arrived back at Withycombe, the house was a blaze of welcoming light. A footman opened the carriage door, and Mrs. Perkin was waiting in the hall, a look of anxious inquiry on her face. "All is well, Mrs. Perkin," Sylvia said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time that night. As she ascended the stairs, she felt Gideon's eyes on her. She was no longer just the steward of his house. She was the Duchess, and she had faced her first test. But Lady Carmichael's words echoed in her mind. "You have an enemy there. Watch your back." The victory tonight felt sharp and clear, but she had a sinking feeling that the battle for Withycombe, and for her place in it, was only just beginning. A brief interlude from the Duke's perspective. Gideon stood in the shadows of the picture gallery, a place he had avoided for 3 years. The black crepe was gone from his first wife's portrait. Sylvia had ordered it removed weeks ago, a quiet, decisive act he had not countermanded. He looked at the smiling, golden-haired woman on the canvas. The pain was no longer a raw, gaping wound. It had become a scar, a permanent part of him, but one that no longer bled at the slightest touch. For years, this house had been his tomb, a place to nurture his grief in frozen silence. Now it was different. He could hear the distant, rhythmic chop of a knife from the kitchens. He could smell the faint, clean scent of wood smoke from the hall fire. He could feel the warmth seeping up through the floorboards. These were the small, mundane proofs of life, and she had brought them all. Sylvia. He had married her for her competence. He had seen it in the stark, honest numbers of her little brown ledger. It was a quality he understood, a virtue in a world of artifice and emotion that had betrayed him. He had expected an efficient administrator, a quiet presence who would remain in her designated sphere. He had not expected her to colonize his life so completely, so silently. He had watched her from a distance at first. He saw her poring over the accounts, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her talking to the staff, not with the condescension of a mistress, but with the quiet authority of a general. He had seen her in the walled garden, her hands in the dirt, coaxing life from derelict soil. It was a mirror of what she was doing to him, to his house, to his entire existence. She was clearing away the weeds, pruning the dead branches, letting the light in. He had not intended to defend her at the assembly. Protection was an emotion, and he had long since sworn off emotion. But when Devereux had aimed his casual, cruel dart, Gideon had felt a surge of something cold and unfamiliar. It was not passion. It was possession. A primitive, absolute certainty that this woman, his Duchess, was not to be touched. She was his. Her quiet dignity, her unyielding integrity, her fierce, hidden strength, they belonged within his domain. An attack on her was an attack on him, on the fragile new order she was building in the ruins of his life. The words had come out of him before he had time to consider them. She has a particular gift for identifying fraud. It was the truth, and it was a warning. He had put the county on notice. He had put Devereux on notice. He left the gallery and walked towards his study. As he passed the open door of the small parlour Sylvia now used as her office, he saw her inside. She was not at her desk. She was on her knees by the fire, a young housemaid beside her. The maid, a girl named Ada, was weeping silently. A tray with a shattered porcelain cup lay on the floor. "It was from the late Duchess's set," the girl sobbed. "Mrs. Perkin will turn me out for sure." Gideon paused, hidden in the shadows of the hall, expecting Sylvia to deliver a stern, if fair, reprimand. "Hush now," Sylvia said, her voice soft. She took a handkerchief from her pocket and gave it to the girl. "It is just a cup, Ada. It can be replaced." "But it was hers," the girl whispered, looking towards the picture gallery. "She would not have wanted your tears to be shed over it," Sylvia said gently. "Now, help me clear this away. We will say nothing of it to Mrs. Perkin. I will take the cost of it from my personal allowance. It will be our secret." Gideon watched as his Duchess, the woman he had hired to impose order, knelt on the floor and helped a frightened servant girl pick up the pieces of a broken cup. It was an act of quiet, profound kindness. It was not about ledgers or accounts. It was about grace. He retreated to his study, a strange turmoil in his chest. This woman was more than competent. She was good. and her goodness was a quiet, steady warmth that was, against his will, beginning to thaw the ice around his heart. He had brought her to Withycombe to be a steward. He had not realized he was bringing home a queen. A quiet queen, for his frozen kingdom. And he knew, with a certainty that both unnerved and intrigued him, that her reign was only just beginning. He poured himself a brandy, but the warmth of the liquor did nothing to quell the unfamiliar heat spreading through him. It was the warmth of a house with its fires lit. It was the warmth of a life beginning again. The quiet rhythm of life at Withycombe continued, but the air was now charged with a new tension. Sylvia felt it in the way the staff now looked to her, not just for instruction, but for protection. She felt it in the lengthening silences between herself and Gideon, silences that were no longer empty, but filled with a weighty, unspoken awareness. And she felt it in the letters that began to arrive from her aunt, Honora. They were masterpieces of passive aggression, filled with cloying sweetness and veiled threats. Honora wrote of her loneliness and reduced circumstances, thinly disguised accusations of Sylvia's ingratitude. She wrote of Felicity's struggles to find a suitable match now that their fortunes had turned. But threaded through the lamentations were sharp, probing questions about Withycombe's finances, about the Duke's habits, about Mr. Fletcher's replacement. Sylvia read them with a growing sense of unease. Her aunt was gathering information. But for what purpose? The answer, she suspected, lay with Piers Devereux. Since the public humiliation at the Assembly, Devereux had been conspicuously absent from Marley society. But Sylvia knew a man like that did not simply accept defeat. He would be nursing his wounded pride, plotting a revenge that was far more subtle and dangerous than a public insult. Lady Carmichael's warning echoed constantly in her thoughts. Watch your back. Sylvia's response was to retreat further into her work, making her systems of accounting even more rigorous and transparent. She created a system of double-entry bookkeeping for every aspect of the ducal finances, with daily logs cross-referenced against weekly summaries. It was a fortress of numbers, each one a stone in the wall she was building to protect the house, and to protect herself. Mrs. Perkin, now her staunchest ally, watched her with worried eyes. "You cannot live in a ledger, Your Grace," she said one evening, finding Sylvia still at her desk long after the house had gone to bed. "A ledger cannot lie, Mrs. Perkin," Sylvia had replied. "People can." The attack, when it came, was not a frontal assault, but a quiet act of sabotage aimed at the very heart of her authority, her integrity. Gideon had been called to London on urgent business concerning his shipping interests. He was to be gone for a fortnight. Before he left, he met with Sylvia in the library. "The annual audit is scheduled for the end of the month," he told her. "My solicitor, Mr. Abbott, will come from London to review the books for the past year. It is a formality, but an important one." He looked at her, his expression serious. "He will find everything in impeccable order, I have no doubt." It was a statement of absolute faith, and it warmed Sylvia more than she cared to admit. "Of course, Your Grace." "Gideon," he said, the word abrupt. She looked up, startled. "What?" "My name is Gideon," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "When we are alone, you will use it." It was a small thing, but it felt momentous. It was a crack in the formal edifice of their contract. It was an invitation into a more personal space. "Gideon," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. A faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his eyes. "I will return before the audit." But he didn't. A storm in the Channel delayed his return voyage. A message arrived, saying he would be 3 days late. The audit would have to proceed without him. Sylvia felt a prickle of apprehension, but she pushed it down. Her books were perfect. There was nothing to fear. Mr. Abbott arrived, a dry, precise man with spectacles perched on his nose. He was polite, but distant. He, along with a junior clerk he had brought from the local magistrate's office in Marley, sequestered themselves in the library with the Withercombe ledgers. Sylvia provided them with everything they requested, her confidence unshaken. On the second day of the audit, Mr. Abbott requested a meeting. Sylvia entered the library to find him standing by the desk, his face grim. The junior clerk, a nervous-looking young man, hovered in the background, avoiding her eyes. "Your Grace," Mr. Abbott began, his tone cold. "We have found a most serious irregularity." He gestured to the open ledger on the desk. It was the main household expense book for the past 6 months. He pointed to a page of entries from 3 months prior. "These disbursements," he said, tapping the page, "to a supplier, the Northern Mercantile Company. A series of payments totaling over £2,000 for goods never delivered. We can find no record of this company. It does not exist." Sylvia stared at the page. The entries were in a script that was a near-perfect imitation of her own, but it was not hers. She could see the subtle differences, the slightly heavier pressure on the downstrokes, the fractionally wider spacing. "That is not my handwriting," she said, her voice quiet. "It is a masterful forgery, if so," Mr. Abbott said skeptically. "But that is not the most damning part." He picked up another document from the desk. It was a bank draft. The funds were not paid to a company. They were deposited into a personal account. An account belonging to a Mrs. Honora Crane. The blood drained from Sylvia's face. It was a trap, elegant in its cruelty and devastating in its design. It made her look not just like a thief, but like a fool, stealing from her husband to funnel money back to the very family he had paid to free her from. It was a story so plausible, so perfectly aimed at her known history, that it was almost impossible to disbelieve. "I did not do this," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to control it. "This is a fabrication." "The evidence is here, in your own ledger, in what appears to be your own hand," Mr. Abbott said, his voice hardening. "Until the Duke returns and this matter can be fully investigated, I must insist that you confine yourself to your rooms. The household staff will be instructed not to answer to your authority." He was, in effect, placing her under house arrest, in her own home. The humiliation was a physical blow. The junior clerk still refused to meet her eyes. In his nervous, shifty gaze, Sylvia saw the hand of Piers Devereux. This was his revenge. A forgery, a planted piece of evidence, a public disgrace. Stripped of her authority, she walked from the library in a daze. The news spread through the house like a poison. The staff, who'd come to trust her, were now confused and fearful. They avoided her gaze, unsure of where their loyalties should lie. Only Mrs. Perkin sought her out, her face a mask of fury. "It's a lie, Your Grace," she whispered fiercely, standing in the doorway of Sylvia's sitting room. "A wicked lie. We all know it." "Knowing it and proving it are two different things, Mrs. Perkin," Sylvia said, sinking into a chair. Her fortress of numbers had been breached from the inside. The evidence, the very thing Gideon prized above all else, was stacked against her. She thought of his face, his cold, appraising eyes. He had trusted her because of her honesty. Now, a forged document screamed that she was a liar and a thief. For the first time since coming to Withercombe, Sylvia felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She sat in her cold, silent room, a prisoner once more, and waited for the Duke to come home, waited for his judgment. And for the first time, she was not sure if he would believe her. The trust between them, so new and fragile, was about to be put to the test, and she feared it would shatter. Gideon arrived 2 days later. The air in the house was thick with a tense, fearful silence that reminded him of the day he had first brought Sylvia to Withycombe. It was a regression, a return to the cold and the gloom. He found Mr. Abbott waiting for him in his study, the forged ledger laid out on the desk like a body on a slab. He listened without expression as the solicitor detailed the findings. The fake company, the payments, the deposit into Honora Crane's account. The evidence was concise, logical, and damning. Any other man would have flown into a rage. Gideon simply grew colder, stiller. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked when Abbott had finished. "Confined to her suite, as I thought prudent, Your Grace." "You thought wrong," Gideon said, his voice lethally soft. "You will bring her to me. Now." A few minutes later, Sylvia entered the study. She looked pale and weary, but her back was straight, her head held high. She did not look like a guilty woman. She looked like a queen facing a coup. She met his gaze across the room, her own eyes searching his, looking for a sign, any sign, of what he was thinking. His face was a marble mask. He did not invite her to sit. He did not speak. He simply gestured to the open ledger on the desk. It was an invitation to inspect the evidence of her own treason. Sylvia walked to the desk. She looked down at the forged page, her expression calm and focused. The silence in the room stretched, taut as a wire. 1 second. 2. 3. She traced a finger over one of the false entries, her touch light, analytical. "This is an excellent forgery," she said, her voice clinical, as if she were discussing a piece of art. "The ink is almost a perfect match. The script is very close to my own. But the forger made 2 mistakes." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "My system is one of double entry. Every expenditure in this ledger is cross-referenced in a daily disbursement log with a corresponding receipt number," she said, her confidence growing as she moved onto the familiar ground of her own meticulous systems. "There will be no entry in the daily log for these payments, and no receipts." "They could have been destroyed," Abbott interjected. "They could," Sylvia agreed. But the forger's second mistake was more fundamental. She looked directly at Gideon. "He thought he was imitating my handwriting, but he was actually imitating my character. He assumed that if I were to steal, I would do so clumsily, that I would use a false company name that could be easily investigated and funnel money directly to my aunt, creating an obvious trail. He made me look like an amateur. And whatever else I may be, Gideon, I am not an amateur." The use of his first name was a deliberate, powerful choice. It was a reminder of the intimacy they had begun to build, a claim on their private world in the face of this public accusation. Gideon's gaze did not waver. He had built his life on evidence. The ledger was evidence. But the woman standing before him, with her fierce intelligence and unshakable self-possession, was also evidence. For months, he had watched her. He had seen her meticulous nature, her profound integrity. He had seen her kindness to a servant girl over a broken cup. The 2 pictures, the clumsy thief and the master steward, could not both be true. "Show me," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Show me the daily logs." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Sylvia. He was giving her a chance. He had not condemned her. He was willing to look at her evidence. "They are in my office," she said. Together they walked to her office, Mr. Abbott trailing behind them like a skeptical shadow. Sylvia unlocked a small cabinet and retrieved the slim, bound volume that was her daily disbursement log. She opened it to the date in question. The pages were filled with her neat, precise script, detailing payments to the butcher, the baker, the blacksmith. There was no mention of a Northern Mercantile Company. There were no £2,000 gaps in the running totals. It was a perfect, unbroken record of an honest household. "The forger had access to the main ledger," Sylvia explained, "but not to my private logs. He created a fiction in one book, not knowing it would be contradicted by the facts in another." Gideon looked from the clean, honest page of the logbook to Sylvia's face. He saw no deceit there, only the quiet, unyielding power of the truth. He had made his decision. "Mr. Abbott," he said, turning to the solicitor, "you will begin a new investigation. I want to know everything about the junior clerk you hired in Mali. I want to know his associates, his debts, his movements for the past month. I want you to find who paid him to commit this forgery." "Your Grace," Abbott stammered, "you believe her?" "I believe the evidence," Gideon stated, his gaze still on Sylvia. "And she has just presented the more convincing case. The Duchess is not a thief. She is, however, the victim of a conspiracy. And we are going to expose it." He turned his full attention back to Sylvia. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a fire she had never seen before. It was the look of a predator who has picked up the scent of his prey. "They meant to ruin you publicly. Instead, we will ruin them. I'm announcing a ball to be held here at Withycombe in 1 week's time. A grand affair to formally introduce my Duchess to the county. Our enemies will not be able to resist attending, to witness your fall from grace. They will walk directly into our trap." He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His grasp was not cold or formal. It was warm, strong, and possessive. A silent, binding promise. "The crisis is over," he said, his voice low and for her ears alone. "The reckoning is about to begin. Together." Sylvia looked down at their joined hands. The trust between them had been tested not by protestations of love or dramatic accusations, but by the quiet, steady weight of facts and character. It had not shattered. It had been forged into something harder, stronger, and infinitely more real. "Together," she agreed, her voice firm. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. The warmth was returning to Withycombe. But a storm was about to break over Mali. The preparations for the ball at Withycombe were a flurry of controlled chaos, orchestrated by Sylvia with military precision. For the staff, it was a declaration of war. Their loyalty, once divided and confused, now coalesced fiercely around their Duchess. They worked with a furious energy, polishing silver that had not been used in a generation, airing out tapestries, and waxing the grand ballroom floor until it shone like a dark mirror. The house, which had been slowly waking, now seemed to hum with anticipation and purpose. Meanwhile, Gideon's investigation proceeded with quiet, ruthless efficiency. Mr. Abbott, now a fervent convert to Sylvia's cause, discovered that the junior clerk from the magistrate's office, a young man named Thomas, had recently paid off a substantial gambling debt. When confronted, Thomas crumbled. He confessed that Piers Devereux had paid him £100 to gain access to the Withycombe ledgers for a single night. Devereux himself had performed the forgery, providing Thomas with the pre-written page to be inserted. Gideon also dispatched an agent to London. The man returned with two key pieces of evidence. The first was the testimony of an ink and paper specialist who, after examining the forged page, confirmed it was a forgery of expert quality, but identifiable by microscopic differences in the iron gall content of the ink. The second was a sworn statement from a bank clerk in London, confirming that on the day after the funds were supposedly deposited, Honora Crane had made a large withdrawal and had been seen in the company of Piers Devereux. The trap was set. All that remained was for the prey to walk into it. Invitations were sent across the county. An invitation to a ball at Withycombe, hosted by the reclusive Duke of Kestrel Chase, was a summons that could not be ignored. As Gideon had predicted, acceptances from Mrs. Honora Crane and Mr. Piers Devereux arrived almost immediately. They would not miss the opportunity to witness Sylvia's final, public humiliation. Gideon also sent a special, handwritten note to Lady Maud Carmichael, which read simply, "Your presence is requested. A matter of justice is to be settled." The night of the ball, Withycombe was transformed. Hundreds of candles blazed in the chandeliers, scattering glittering light across the great hall. An orchestra played from the minstrel's gallery. The house was alive, warm, and filled with the murmur of 100 conversations as the cream of county society arrived. Sylvia stood beside Gideon at the top of the grand staircase, receiving their guests. She was not the plain, overlooked woman from the Marley Assembly. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, a colour that brought out the hidden fire in her hazel eyes. It had been commissioned by Gideon, his only instruction to the London dressmaker being to create a gown worthy of a duchess. Around her neck, she wore no diamonds, no rubies. She wore only her small, simple silver locket. It was a statement of who she was, a reminder of the strength that had brought her here. When Honora Crane and Piers Devereux arrived, their faces were masks of feigned sympathy and triumphant malice. "My dear Sylvia," Honora cooed, taking her hand. "How brave of you to go on with this festivity. We have heard the most distressing rumours." "Indeed," Devereux added, his smile a predatory slash. "But we are here to offer our support, naturally." "Your support is noted," Gideon said, his voice as cold as the grave. He guided Sylvia away, leaving them standing in the hall, their eyes sweeping the room, eager for the drama to unfold. Later, when the ballroom was at its most crowded, Gideon signaled to the orchestra leader. The music died away. A sudden, expectant hush fell over the assembly. All eyes turned to the Duke, who stood on a small, raised dais at the end of the room, Sylvia at his side. "I thank you all for coming to Withycombe tonight," Gideon began, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. "I have invited you here not only to celebrate, but to bear witness." A nervous ripple went through the crowd. This was not the typical speech of a host. "As many of you have no doubt heard through the ever-efficient channels of local gossip," he continued, a dry edge to his words, "a shadow has fallen over my house. An accusation of theft and fraud has been levelled against my wife, the Duchess." He paused. In the dead silence, he could hear Honora's soft, satisfied sigh. Piers Devereux's expression was one of rapt attention. "The evidence for this accusation," Gideon went on, "is an entry in a household ledger indicating a payment of £2,000 to a non-existent company, funds which were later traced to an account belonging to Mrs. Honora Crane." He looked directly at Honora, whose face had gone rigid. "And the forgery in the ledger was so expertly done that it was nearly indistinguishable from my wife's own hand. He let that hang in the air. Then he played his first card. I have here a sworn affidavit from one of London's foremost experts on ink and paper. He testifies, under oath, that the page in question is a forgery. The ink composition does not match any used in this house. He held up the document for all to see. A collective gasp went through the room. Honora and Piers exchanged a look, no longer triumphant, but startled. A forgery, however, requires a forger, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. And someone to place it in the ledger. He gestured to the side of the room. Two stern-faced men, local constables, stepped forward. Between them was the pale, trembling figure of the clerk, Thomas. Mr. Thomas, Gideon commanded, tell this assembly what you told me. The young man, his eyes wide with terror, began to speak, his voice barely a whisper at first, then growing stronger. Mr. Piers Devereux. He paid me £100 to switch the pages in the ledger. He gave me the new page, already written. The name dropped like a stone into the silent room. Every head turned towards Piers Devereux. His polished mask had shattered completely, revealing the panicked, cornered man beneath. This is an outrage! A lie! The boy is coerced! He blustered. Is it? Gideon's voice cut through his protests like a whip. He produced another document. This is a sworn statement from a clerk at the London bank where Mrs. Crane keeps her account. He testifies that Mr. Devereux was with Mrs. Crane when she withdrew a large sum of cash, the day after the forged entry was made. He testifies that he overheard them discussing their brilliant plan to put the little bookkeeper back in her place. Honora let out a small, strangled cry. The trap had closed, and now it was Sylvia's turn. She stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep or rage. She spoke with the calm, devastating precision of a final accounting. For 5 years, she began, her quiet voice carrying in the profound silence. I managed my aunt's household. I paid her bills, stretched her dwindling funds, and recorded every penny of her expenditures, while she and my cousin lived in a luxury they could not afford. She called it my duty. In truth, it was unpaid labor. The Duke, my husband, freed me from that servitude. My aunt could not forgive me for that freedom. Mr. Devereux could not forgive my husband for defending my honor. This was their revenge. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the county's elite, before settling on her aunt. You did not think I was worthy of being a duchess. You thought I was nothing more than a servant. But you forgot one thing about me, Aunt Honora. I keep very, very good records. It was the final, killing blow. The quiet declaration of her own competence, the very quality they had sought to turn against her, was now the instrument of their ruin. Lady Maud Carmichael, who had been watching the entire spectacle with an expression of grim satisfaction, now spoke, her voice booming through the hall. Well, Mr. Devereux, she declared, it seems your credit has finally run out. As a magistrate of this county, I suggest you do not try to leave town. And as for you, Mrs. Crane, I believe the proper term for your little scheme is conspiracy to commit fraud, a criminal offence. The assembly erupted. Society, which had been so quick to whisper against Sylvia, now turned on Honora and Devereux with the ferocity of a pack. They were surrounded, not by friends, but by accusers. Their social standing, their reputations, everything they had built their lives upon, evaporated in an instant. Humiliated and exposed, they were utterly, publicly, and irrevocably ruined. In the midst of the chaos, Gideon took Sylvia's arm and led her from the dais, through a side door and out of the ballroom. They walked in silence through the quiet, lamplit corridors of the house, leaving the sounds of the public reckoning behind them. He did not stop until they had passed through the house and out into the cool night air. He led her to the one place that was truly hers, the walled garden. The walled garden was a sanctuary of peace in the cool night. A full moon hung in the sky, bathing the partially restored paths and the tangled, sleeping rose bushes in a soft, silvery light. The chaotic sounds of the ball were a distant murmur, a storm that had passed them by. Here, there was only the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine, and the quiet presence of the two of them, standing together in the aftermath. Gideon had not released her arm. Now he turned to face her, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. His touch was no longer formal or possessive. It was reverent. In the moonlight, the harsh, frozen lines of his face seemed to have melted away, leaving behind a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen before. "They sought to define you by your past," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "As a servant, a bookkeeper. They were wrong." His thumbs traced the line of her jaw. "Your past is not what you were. It is what made you. It gave you a strength they could never comprehend." Sylvia's heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The final accounting. Not of money, but of the heart. "You brought this house back to life," he continued, his gaze searching hers, intense and unwavering. "You filled it with warmth and light. You gave it a soul again. But it was not just the house, Sylvia. You brought me back to life." And then, to her utter astonishment, the proud, unbending Duke of Kestrel Chase slowly sank to one knee before her on the damp gravel path. It was not the gesture of a supplicant, but the profound, solemn act of a king swearing fealty. "Our marriage was a contract," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "A business arrangement, based on convenience and skill. I wish to renegotiate the terms." He took her hand, his grasp warm and firm, a vital anchor in the swirling emotions of the night. "I am asking you, not as my duchess, but as the woman I have come to admire above all others. I am asking you to be my wife. In truth, in all things. Not because of a contract, but because of a choice. My choice." He paused, his throat working. "I am asking you, Sylvia Bellamy 7, to share your life with me, to build a life with me, to let me spend the rest of my days proving I am worthy of the woman who stood her ground when the world sought to bring her low. To be Sylvia, with me, together." Tears she had refused to shed in her darkest moments now welled in her eyes. But these were not tears of sorrow or humiliation. They were tears of overwhelming, unexpected joy. This cold, broken man had seen her from the very beginning. He had seen her competence, her integrity, her strength. He had trusted her, defended her, and fought for her. And now, he was offering her the one thing she had never dreamed of having. A love that was as honest and true as one of her own ledgers. She looked down at him, this proud duke kneeling in the dirt of the garden she had reclaimed, and she saw not her master, but her partner, her equal, her home. She found her voice, and it was as clear and steady as it had been when she faced down her enemies in the ballroom. "Yes," she whispered. Then, more firmly, letting the single word hold all the weight of her heart. "Yes, Gideon. Together." He rose to his feet, a slow, wondering smile transforming his face, a sunrise after a long winter. He gently took the small silver locket that rested at her throat. With infinite care, he opened the tiny clasp. Inside was a miniature portrait of her mother. He looked at it for a long moment, then met Sylvia's eyes. "She would be proud," he murmured. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of recognition, of homecoming. It was quiet, certain, and absolute. A seal on a new contract, written not on paper, but on the heart. In the silent, moonlit garden, surrounded by the life she had nurtured from ruins, Sylvia knew she was finally, truly, home. The house was warm. Her heart was warmer. And for the first time in her life, she was not just enduring. She was choosing. And she was chosen. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. 2 years later, Withycombe was no longer known as the Duke's derelict estate. It was spoken of throughout the county as the warmest, most vibrant home in Marley. The gardens were a riot of colour. The lawns were manicured, and the grey stone walls seemed to have absorbed the light and laughter that now filled the halls. The house was no longer a monument to grief, but a testament to love. Sylvia stood in the centre of the walled garden, which was now her masterpiece. Roses of every shade climbed the ancient brick walls, their scent heavy and sweet in the summer air. The paths were clear, the sundial gleamed in the sun, and the stone bench had been repaired, a comfortable spot for two. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked woman in a worn dress. She was a duchess, confident and serene, her life as rich and flourishing as the garden around her. The door to the garden opened, and Gideon appeared. The 2 years of marriage had erased the last vestiges of the frozen, grieving man he had once been. The harsh lines of his face had softened, and he smiled easily now, a smile reserved only for her. He walked to her side, his arm sliding naturally around her waist. "Inspecting your kingdom," he murmured, kissing her temple. "Just enjoying the peace," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. Their easy, affectionate intimacy was a constant, quiet joy. "Mrs. Perkin is bringing tea," he said. "She worries you spend too much time in the sun." "Mrs. Perkin worries about everything," Sylvia said, with a fond smile. The formidable housekeeper had become her fiercest guardian and most devoted friend. The entire staff served them with a loyalty that was absolute, born of respect and affection. They sat together on the stone bench, their hands intertwined. They spoke of small domestic things, a tenant farmer's new baby, a promising colt in the stables, Lady Maud Carmichael's latest scathing but hilarious letter from Bath. Their life was a tapestry woven from these quiet, happy moments. The past had not been erased, but had found its proper place. Piers Devereux had fled the country to escape his creditors and the looming threat of prosecution. He was a disgraced exile, his name a cautionary tale. Aunt Honora and Felicity lived in a small cottage in a distant shire, their circumstances drastically reduced. Felicity, stripped of her finery and social ambitions, had been forced to take a position as a paid companion to an elderly widow. It was a partial, imperfect reckoning. Sylvia occasionally received letters from her, no longer filled with condescension, but with a weary, grudging respect for the cousin she had so badly underestimated. Sylvia answered them politely, but kept her distance. Some wounds did not need to be reopened. Gideon reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. "I had something made for you," he said. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a locket. It was fashioned from platinum, with a single, perfect diamond sparkling at its center. It was a duchess's jewel, exquisite and priceless. "It's beautiful," Sylvia breathed. "It is not meant to replace the old one," he said softly, understanding her without her needing to speak. "But I thought perhaps it could hold a new memory." Sylvia smiled and touched the old, worn silver locket that still hung around her neck. It had seen her through the worst of times. It was a symbol of her endurance, of the mother who had given her strength. It was a part of her story. "The old one holds my past," she said. "This one." She took the new locket from the box. "This one will hold our future." He helped her fasten it around her neck, where it lay beside its simpler, older companion. Two parts of a single story. The story of a woman who had been left in a house without heat and had made it the warmest home in the county. Not just with fires and balanced ledgers, but with a quiet courage and an unyielding heart. Gideon took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He looked from her face to the flourishing garden, to the great house standing warm and solid behind them. Everything in his world that was good, everything that was alive, had come from her. She had not been a rescuer in a grand, dramatic sense. She had simply been herself, honest, capable, and true. And that had been more than enough. It had been everything. "I love you, Sylvia," he said, the words as plain and solid as the stone bench beneath them. "And I love you, Gideon," she replied, her heart full. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house behind them glowed, every window a warm, welcoming eye. They were home. They were together. And the hours they counted were only the sunny ones. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.